So welcome to the webinar. These are strange times, but that doesn't mean that we can't have the best of minds talking to you. So Sankaran Krishna is Professor of Political Science at the University of Hawaii and the author of Globalization and Post-Colonialism, Hegemony and Resistance in the 21st Century. He believes, and I quote, that colonized IR demeans and diminishes all of us. Decolonizing the discipline is an ongoing and never to be contemplated critical questioning of our everyday practices and logics of interpretation. Welcome, Krishna. Let's start with a fairly straightforward question. This is a week when the students are reading on modernization theory. And I wanted to ask you, is there a problem with modernization theory? If so, what is it? How does the history of colonialism shed light on the genealogy of modernization theory? So if you could say a few words.
Sure, Shirin. First of all, thank you for having me on this as part of this course that you're teaching. So it's a very straightforward and seemingly simple question, and those are often the best. Is there a problem with modernization theory? I would say absolutely. And let's go straight to the ground floor of why there is a problem with modernization theory. Modernization theory, I would argue, along with many others, looks at the world through what I would call methodological nationalism. That is to say, it sees a planet as occupied by, divided into discrete nation states, bounded territories called nations, countries, whatever you want to call them. And it regards the process of economic development, of industrialization, of modernization as something which is akin to a race or a sprint or a competition between these various territorial units. And so you can say some countries have achieved modernization or industrialization faster than others. This must be because of some individual genius to these countries, something about their race, something about their natural resources, something about their capacity for hard work, something about their inventiveness. That is what has given them this leg up in the process of advancing. And the lack of those qualities in certain other places and countries is the reason for their being very slow in development. And so these later countries, these slower countries, these more backward countries should look to the more advanced ones and learn from them what they have. So you can already see the connections between this kind of seeing the world as composed of discrete national territories, competition between them, etc., as producing a world in which some are better, others are worse. Some should learn, others should be the teachers, and from there to regard things like Eurocentrism, racism, etc., as almost naturally following. Now, what's the problem with this story? The problem with this story, quite simply, is events like industrialization, urbanization, the movement towards economic development don't happen within territorially bounded nation states. They happen across the planet. They happen in ways that suffuse the entire planet through its flows, migrations, movements of capital, etc. So if you look at the world starting from about 1492, the year Columbus discovers the New World, you see a process of tremendous planetary change occurring. It marks the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. It marks the genocide of native peoples in the New World. It marks the emergence of a sort of triangular trade which links Europe, Africa, and the New World. And all of these things are happening on a planetary scale. And the wealth from the New World has consequences in continents like Africa, the New World, and Europe, which are not to be measured at the level of a territorially bounded nation state. So when you have a book like Walt Rostow's The Stages of Modernization, notice that the subtext title of that book is A Non-Communist Manifesto. And it was published first in 1959. And Rostow gets a Nobel in economics, no less, for the publication of the book. And what you have very early on in the book is literally what I said earlier about a methodological nationalism, which sees development as happening in these containers called nations. So he shows how Britain was the first to launch its developmental surge. The United States came second, Germany third, etc., etc. It's like they're all runners on separate lanes on a racetrack, and Britain has taken off first, and then the United States follows, and Germany follows, etc. That metaphor is completely misleading, even though it's extraordinarily persuasive. The fact is, when Britain first starts experiencing its industrial revolution, that's already a consequence of a global set of events. The primitive accumulation of capital from trade with the New World, from engaging in the slave trade, all of these things furnishes, not to mention the East India Company and its trade with the Indies. All of these things produce a huge amount of capital, which funnels the rise of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So it's not just British smarts, British acumen, British hard work or resources like iron and coal, which are responsible for Britain being the first country to experience the Industrial Revolution. That very statement, Britain is the first to experience the Industrial Revolution, is fundamentally wrong at so many levels. The world went through an Industrial Revolution in that period, and for a variety of reasons, the predominant set of positive outcomes from that were concentrated in regions like Britain, and many of the negative consequences were visited upon Africa, upon the New World, upon India, and places like that. So that is my fundamental problem with modernization theory. It takes a global phenomenon and sort of works it through a nation-state lens or grid, which then produces these outcomes like Eurocentrism, racism, the idea of some nations being superior to others, and the idea that people in different parts of the world have much to learn from one set of people who have somehow found the answers to all of these things. So, sorry for that very long answer, but I don't know if it made any sense.
Absolutely, it was fascinating and really thought-provoking. So, could you say a little bit more though about the history of colonialism and the way in which it sort of unravels the narrative of modernization?
Sure, that's I think a very logical second venue of discussion to move after the very first one. So I've actually got a chapter called What is Colonialism? Or to be precise, the title is How Does Colonialism Work? Is the title of the chapter. And it's published in this book by Jenny Edkins and Maya Zeffus called Global Politics. And it's a sort of succinct 30-page distillation of exactly the response to the question that you're asking. And so let me just quickly flesh it out. One has to remember that Columbus went halfway across the world without asking for directions because he was looking for the Indies. So the Indies, India, must have been something worth taking such huge risks for in order to find it. And that was because these were lands of fabled riches, of spices, of silks, of handicrafts, of whole sets of goods that were seen as highly desirable. If that's the image of the Indies in 1492, what do we think of when we think of places like India today? We think of poverty, We think of overpopulation. We think of misery. We think of people trying to migrate from there to the West. 500 years is a very, very small blip of time in the length of human existence on this planet. And yet we've gone from regarding certain spaces as rich and fabled to poor and completely impoverished. That shift in a matter of 500 years, the key difference there, I would say, is colonialism. And one way to understand this is to look at perhaps the world's longest colony on one side and the world's biggest colonial power on the other. So let's look at the encounter between Britain and India, okay, to understand how colonialism works. So Britain's first encounter with India in the modern era, you might say, is with the establishment of the East India Company in the early 1600s. The East India Company was a group of investors based in Britain whose sole purpose was to buy things in India and then sell them in Europe for a very hefty profit, right? So when the British East India Company is established in India, they are literally on their knees begging the Mughal emperor for the rights to be able to trade with India. So they come there as literally supplicants, looking for the opportunity to trade. India is at this time one of the world's largest economies. It's renowned for the quality of its handicrafts, for its artisanal work, for its textiles, for its spices, for a whole range of things. So as the East India Company establishes itself, and it remains a trading corporation into the early 1700s, but certain changes start happening during the 18th century. For one thing, the Mughal Empire, which had been controlling India, goes into a sort of terminal decline, the way dynasties often do. The second thing that happens is Britain, because of its engagement in the Atlantic slave trade, because of its discovery of the riches of the New World, because of the influx of money coming into Britain from all of these sources, starts going through first an agricultural and then an industrial revolution in its own class structure, right? So things like manufacturing are beginning to take place in the UK as a result of these global processes, while India is going through a period of political fragmentation and decline. Now, this combination of events will have very fatal consequences for the two countries. I mean, for India, and very good consequences for Britain. So as the story proceeds to the 18th century, the East India Company becomes more than just a trading partner. It has security forces to protect its factories and warehouses. It starts getting involved in the internecine warfare between these kingdoms and principalities that succeed the Mughal Empire, and gradually becomes a very potent physical, political, and economic presence in the subcontinent. So it in fact becomes a sovereign entity. It starts collecting land revenue. It starts establishing armies. It starts engaging in further monopolistic trade. It starts converting farmers from the production of food crops into the production of opium for export to China. So you might say actually the East India Company is the first multinational drug dealer in the world. There is a solid evidence to establish and support a claim like that. Now I want to sort of train the focus even more closely onto just about 5 decades, from the start of the Industrial Revolution, about 1770, to about 1820, to understand how colonialism works. So by around the 1770s, as the Industrial Revolution is gaining ground in the regions of Britain, India shifts from being one of the world's largest exporter of cotton goods and textiles in the late 18th century to becoming one of the world's largest importers of raw cotton. Britain shifts from being a major importer of finished goods from places like India to a major exporter of manufactured commodities like textiles and other things. So you can just see the statistics in bilateral trade between India and Britain at this time to establish certain things that are happening. As Britain is industrializing, India is deindustrializing. Those traditional artisanal based crafts, all of those industries are being wiped out because India has lost political sovereignty, and so it cannot withstand the influx of manufactured imports from India. You just have to go across to the United States to see what's happening at this time, the colonies, to see the importance of colonialism. In 1793, well, first of all, the US War of Independence from Britain was precisely over issues of economic sovereignty. So Hamilton actually writes in his report on manufactures that if we persist in free trade with Britain, the 13 colonies will forever remain agricultural hinterlands. We will be drawers of water and hewers of wood, is the phrase that he uses. And he says we need to protect ourselves from free trade until such time as we can engage Britain on an equal footing. And the report on manufactures, as it is correctly called, is how do we establish a manufacturing base in the 13 colonies in order to hold our own against the United Kingdom. Now, the other country that successfully does this in Asia in the 19th century is Japan. It's not at all a coincidence for me that in the 20th century, two of the leading economic powers, and the only one really in the first half of the 20th century from Asia is Japan, because they successfully resisted colonialism. And Japan, by the way, is doing this in a very self-aware way. There are documents from the Japanese ruling the ruling parties, the ruling from the kingdom, which say if we do not stop the Westerners at bay, and if we do not resist being colonized, our fate will become that of India and China. So as Britain is industrializing, India is deindustrializing. There's much more to it than just that. As a society industrializes, its population moves to cities. In India, you find actually the reverse. As formerly industrial towns like Dhaka and Murshidabad and others deindustrialize, people leave the cities to go to the villages. As countries urbanize and people move into cities, the sense of having smaller families begins to become more and more obvious. So Britain's population starts leveling out. In India, as more and more people leave cities and move to the countryside, instead of urbanization, you're having ruralization. The incentive to have small families actually declines. You start going in for larger families. In part, it's because of lack of literacy, it's lack of women's rights, it's lack of certain things. But the very process of deindustrialization and peasantization starts making sense in a perverse way to start having larger families. Now, as labor contracts in the English countryside, you move into larger mechanized farms. In India, as more and more children return to the parental roots back in the village, plots get divided further and further. It's a disincentive to move into technology. It's an incentive to move into more labor-intensive forms of production. Do you see what I'm saying? That development and underdevelopment become two sides of the same coin. Just as industrialization and deindustrialization, urbanization and ruralization. Now, technology works in certain ways. Labor-saving technologies increase tremendously the productivity of things like agriculture. Labor-intensive technologies, on the other hand, constitute in their own way a ceiling on the kind of productivity that you can achieve, etc. So, and I've not even touched the cultural, psychological, social domains of colonialism. As Britain becomes the world's leading power, it starts making sense for people all over the world to equate the learning of English with becoming more advanced, becoming more civilized, becoming more intellectual. So people in India drift away from their mother tongues and start regarding proficiency in English as a hallmark of advancement. Uh, Cultures lose their sense of their own uniqueness, of their worth. This is what colonialism really is. So India's political system starts mimicking that, consciously mimics that of the British parliamentary system. So you take something like, well, what about the railways? Weren't they a major thing that colonialism did? Yes. But mile for mile, the Indian railway was one of the costliest railways built anywhere in the world, because British investors were the ones providing the money for the construction of the Indian railways. And they were guaranteed a certain return on investment, irrespective of the actual performance, the actual costs of the construction of these railways. If you look at the construction of the railways themselves, it follows a classically colonial pattern. It was designed with two ends in mind. One is the rapid export of Indian minerals, raw materials, and agricultural goods out of the port cities, and the dissemination of British manufactured imports into India, into the countryside. And the second was the rapid movement of troops of the British Indian Army to quell disturbances, etc. So for the longest time, two Indian cities weren't so much connected with each other as all of India's hinterland was connected to the port cities. You can see this in contemporary Africa, for example. Two African cities are likely to involve a change of planes in Paris. Two Latin American cities are likely to involve sometimes a change of planes in Miami. So these patterns from those colonial times endure. But my larger point is this. Colonialism is directly a part of the modernization story, because this was the mechanism by which certain zones, certain territories in the world achieved the status of being advanced, of being modern, of being desirable. The flip side of that was the conversion of other areas of the world into overpopulated, rural, backward, deindustrialized, culturally imitative rather than original spaces of the world. So I want to emphasize that colonialism is not just the economic plunder and pillage of certain areas by more powerful others. That's certainly a very important and significant part of the story. I don't mean to minimize that, but it is only one part of the story. There are equally damaging effects that colonialism produces in social, psychological, cultural, and other domains. And some of those endure even beyond changes in the economic sphere. So in contemporary South Korea, which is in many ways an economic success story, the desire to learn English and to appear westernized is huge. In China, one of the biggest industries, if you will, is English teaching schools. So again, a long answer to a relatively straightforward question. I think I'll stop there, though, on that one.
Thanks, Krishna. That was fantastic and very clear. So actually, sort of, that's the kind of history and the genealogy of modernization, which you have kind of outlined and mapped for us, which with such clarity. But I was also thinking, like, why should our students, whether it is in Hawaii or in Warwick, be bothered with all this? I mean, it is a framework to understanding development and international development, fine. But why does decolonizing development, as you have just done, through challenging the modernization paradigm, should matter for us now, today?
It matters in all sorts of ways. Let's, before I turn to Hawaii, let's turn for a moment to the situation in the place you're living in the UK. So you actually have people saying things like, all these migrants, all these immigrants, all these colored people should be sent back where they came from. Well, there is no question of sending back people where they came from, because the very fact that Britain is today an advanced industrial power owes to a 4 centuries long process of interacting with the globe. Everything about it, about Britain as a nation state, as a culture, as a civilization, owes to its global linkages, its global interactions. These are people who were, in many cases, asked to come to Britain in the aftermath of the Second World War because of severe labor shortages. They are not dispensable commodities that you can use and then get rid of when it no longer suits your fancy. That is not how history works. Having left such a gigantic footprint on the world in terms of economics, politics, culture, etc., you cannot now lift your drawbridges and say, Britain is a white island and we want to keep it that way. It never was, and it cannot do that going into the future, right? Now, coming to a place like Hawaii, for much of the early and middle of the 20th century, Native Hawaiian students were discouraged from learning their own mother tongue. Hawaiian was seen as a language of the past, a language that was dying, a language that was, coterminous with backwardness, non-modern, uncivilized, etc. So a Native Hawaiian student entering the University of Hawaii campus felt already demeaned and classified as an outsider. This is a university that is actually built upon land stolen from the Native Hawaiians. And yet it was seen as a place where not only Native Hawaiian language, but even the local Creole, what is sometimes called Pidgin, which is a combination of the languages of the various ethnicities that, were together in the plantations and in everyday life in Hawaii. Pidgin was seen as something inferior, as something that had to be left at the doors of the campus, at the borders of the campus. So in every way, a Native Hawaiian student was made to feel diminished in a university in their own land. So it was almost like, if you want to grow up, if you want to become an adult, you had to leave Hawaiian behind and adopt English or the language of the United States in many ways as your trajectory. Now, this is, a process that's not only extraordinarily humiliating. What is most pernicious about it is you don't see it as humiliation. You see it as something, as a set of steps that you need to go through in order to achieve maturity, adulthood, citizenship, etc. You see the parallel to the story of modernization. Giving up everything that you are and engaging in this enterprise of mimicry, it becomes the definition of selfhood. Now, it took an enormous amount of effort by some incredible people within the Native Hawaiian community to change this, right? So by the 1960s, 70s, 80s, as part of a wider civil rights movement within the United States, as part of the American Indian movement, as part of the feminist movement, as part of a global upsurge against imperialism and racism and things like the Vietnam War and things like that, you had a Native Hawaiian resurgence as well. So today you have one of the world's most profound and proficient academic institutions in the University of Hawaii in the Center for Hawaiian Studies. You have students from here, Native Hawaiian students, going on to do PhDs from the best universities across the world, and many of them coming back here to teach. You have Hawaiian language immersion schools. You have the resurgence of practices like the hula. You have the resurgence of practices like Native Hawaiian cultivation of taro and other things. So you've got a widespread movement for decolonization and the recovery of Hawaiian sovereignty. And many of the weapons for this have been actually provided by decolonial scholarship of the sort that many of us engage in, while obviously giving the primary credit to Native Hawaiian intellectuals and their schools and their immersion programs and their hula teaching schools and institutions like that. We have to also give some credit to a global process of decolonial scholarship in fields like development studies, international relations, comparative politics, history, anthropology, and all these fields in promoting and providing some of the ammunition, intellectual ammunition with which to fight back. So my point here is this: colonialism is not something that began with, say, the entry of the East India Company into India in the early 1600s and ended in 1947 when the British beat a retreat from its Indian colonies. It is something that endures long after. It is something that informs the racist policies of the Tories in Britain, the Republican Party in the United States, and places, similar stories are unfolding in France, you name it, in all of these places. So the tools for resisting such policies, anti-immigrant policies, policies which go against the lower classes, against industrial workers, against all of such things, comes from an understanding of the history of these encounters. And they are invariably our first line of defense. As the statement goes, we are here now because you were once there. So yeah, colonialism is not something in the past. It's very much alive and will continue to be alive as we combat racism, sexism, homophobia, and a whole range of identitarian issues in our times.
Krishna, thank you very much for that. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you. And also, I think that the students will really be able to put your readings and your writings in this broader framework which you have set out for us. So I thank you very much for participating in this webinar.
Thanks for the opportunity, Shirin. It's been a pleasure talking to you.